Hello. So a common and these days very popular wrong view or pitfall, or something that sounds true but when examined closely doesn't sustain itself under honest observation. There's a couple of these types of wrong views that I want to talk about. I don't really have a list, so I'm just sort of gonna freestyle it or wing it. So the first unexamined wrong view is I'm thinking, do I want to start with this one? Let's think of another one. For example, let's say non-duality. There we go. Or yeah, let's say non-duality for starters. So the claim is everything is one. Maybe that's not the... There's different expressions for it people use. Maybe some will disagree if I say everything is one. Everything is non-dual, okay? Like there's no separation, right? That's the view. Or it can be expressed as there is an ultimate reality and a non-ultimate, like what would you call it? Reality, like a conceptual reality. And that all hinges on the perception or intellectual conclusion that there is no separation, right? That everything is sort of one giant thing. Maybe giant thing is not the best way to put it. That there's some sort of essential principle like awareness, God, the Tao, true self, soul, whatever may it be, right? That governs all these things. And first I'd like to target the claim that there's no separation. So first of all, there's no clear separation, right? The borders are a little messy, but there's definitely a variety of different experiences, different forms for the eyes, different colors, whatever it may be. There is a variety, and that there are distinct flavors, right? For example, it just doesn't hold up under observation, right? Like this pine cone, like it has a clear noticeable border, right? It's not its own thing. It arose due to conditions, right? So yes, it's not self-arising, it's not a separate thing per se, but it's also not like completely meshed into reality, right? There's a clear, I can hold it, I can do stuff with it, I can do stuff with a leaf. I can throw this and it hit the tree, but I can't throw a leaf like that. So there's clear distinctions, right? Saying everything is one is sort of hinges on that there's no clear separation, sure, that experience is largely or completely mental, and there's no clear separation between mental things, but there is like a clear separation between vision and hearing, right? For example, like sights are not sounds, so that's already two things I can distinguish pretty clearly, if it's not obvious that you can distinguish many more things. So what I'm trying to say is there can be a, when conceptual thinking stops, for example, due to concentration, meditation, just sometimes it just stops due to conditions, right? There can be a sense of there is no separation between the observer and the observed, right? But at the same time, there can also be a sense of separation between the observer and the observed. Do you get what I'm saying? Both of these things are conditioned perceptions. So the honest observation is it's conditioned. Like sometimes it's perceived as unity, sometimes it's perceived as many. You cannot say ultimately all is one. We don't even share an experience. You can't see my memories right now, or like there's clear separations, right? And yes, then it hinges also on the like everything is interconnected idea, because it is, like things are causally linked, right? Like you change one thing, it can affect the whole system, but that's like things arise due to conditions. Like if you have sunlight, if you have soil, if you have water, if you have a seed, a plant is gonna grow, but that plant is gonna be a distinct form you can see, you can point at it, you can name it, you can pull it out of the ground. So saying it's all one is not how it's actually seen, how it's actually experienced. It's a partial observation hinging on lack of clear separation, the large mental part of existence. And it can be an intellectual conclusion, it can come from a state of, like you have the formless attainments, like attainment of infinite consciousness, infinite nothingness, infinite space, perception, non-perception. So like any of these could be mistaken for all is one, because if you have a perception of infinite consciousness, the mind is going to conclude consciousness is infinite, therefore it's the only thing, right? Or, you know what I'm saying? It also can hinge on reifying the most stable seeming aspect of experience. For example, consciousness seems pretty stable, right? Experience almost hinges on being known to be called experience, right? But consciousness is not always present. Like example, we were hanging out, I got knocked out. You would remember the gap, I would not remember the gap. I wouldn't be conscious for that gap. Consciousness has blips. Like it's not constantly arising, but there's still a conditioned world arising, many worlds, many realms, whatever. Conditions do not depend on consciousness to exist. Conditions depend on other conditions to exist. Like if you have a cow, you're gonna have milk. Like if you don't have a cow, you're not gonna have milk. So the milk depends on the cow. If you have food, you'll have the cow, right? So just saying it's all one and reducing liberation to either a conceptual insight or an observation or a state achieved by concentration and effort does not hold up under direct observation. It can be perceived that way, but since the perceiving of it that way requires certain conditions to be met, that is not a stable perception of truth. That is a conditioned perception of unity. So that's the first wrong view that some people mistake for liberation, mistake for truth. And that also discredits the gradual training, because how the Buddha taught it is a gradual uprooting of the defilements, culminating in the liberation of mind by wisdom and practice. Like practice is necessary, because just like a fire, first you have to stop adding fuel to it, and then you gotta let it burn out. Those are two distinct conditions that don't just happen on their own. If you just perceive everything as one and then rest in some sort of state of mindfulness or heightened awareness, right, then you're not gonna actually have the insight to uproot the defilements. It's not just gonna arise on its own. That's why this whole camp's just stop thought and the truth will reveal itself is not true. Like that's not how it works. It requires mindfulness and investigation. You're not gonna see suffering without directing your attention to it. At the very least, perhaps attention may accidentally get directed there, but since human perception and attention is highly conditioned to perceive pleasant as desirable, unpleasant as to be avoided, and neutral as not seen clearly, then just sitting and being aware is not gonna change the lifetime of conditioning to see otherwise. You have to genuinely apply your attention how the Buddha describes it, which is literally doing something. It is a practice which, yes, later can stabilize in a stable perception called the right view, which, yes, can culminate in stream entry, the uprooting of the first three fetters. But that, as you can see, is a distinct training, a distinct process. It is not dependent on just end your thought and see. In fact, thought is not the enemy. Conceptions are not the enemy. Like I've heard people say, oh, conceptions, you just put a border under something undefinable. Well, no, you point at it, at something that you can directly experience. Like, for example, if you get kicked in the balls, that's painful. I can say, you're feeling pain. And if you say, calling it pain, that's not what it actually is. Well, yeah, but it also is useful to communicate. Like, I know how pain feels, you know how pain feels. It might not be perfectly the same, but if you say I'm hurt, the other person will kind of have an idea of it, right? Because it does hinge on an actual experience of pain. It's not so vague as some people might want you to believe it is. So my point is, other wrong view, concepts are the enemy. You have to stop concepts. No, concepts can be annoying. They can be unskillful mental proliferation, the Buddha called papanka, but they can also serve a purpose for contemplation, for setting intentions, for inspiration. In fact, the whole Buddhist Dharma is in concept, is it not? It points to seeing directly, which is non-conceptual, but it does so through concepts. So again, concepts, they can be skillful, they can be unskillful. Turning them off will not automatically uproot the defilements. What does uproot the defilements is sense restraint, ethics, sense restraint, and then wise attention, supported by concentration and mindfulness and the other factors of enlightenment. So it's a process of seeing clearly what leads to suffering and then not feeding it till it burns out by non-feeding, right? Same as you stop adding fuel to a fire, you see clearly this leads to suffering, you see the cause, and you, by non-identification, by seeing clearly the three marks, by guarding the sense doors, by practicing restraint, maintaining mindfulness, right? Mindfulness. So you have to cultivate mindfulness, you have to cultivate investigation of states. You have to support that practice by cultivating concentration. It's genuine practice, and it cannot be just see and you're enlightened. That is not a thing, right? Like, seeing insight supports practice, practice supports insight. One insight leads to uprooting, but you can't uproot everything at once. You need insight into greed, uproots greed. Insight into sensuality, uproots sensuality. Insight into self, uproots no self. The 10 fetters are 10 distinct fetters, and insight into each one. There is a general insight in the sense whatever arises ceases, which is the insight of stream entry, but that only sets the view to be correct. Ignorance is then uprooted by maintaining mindfulness, and then because your perception is conditioned to see incorrectly, you maintain mindfulness, apply investigation how the Buddha taught it, to basically see correctly, correct your perception, and then a correct perception leads to the withholding of fuel, and the withholding of fuel leads to eventual cessation. So that's the process. Insight does the withholding of fuel. Cessation still has to happen by genuinely being mindful so insight can do its work. Because you cultivate wisdom, but if you're not mindful, wisdom is not going to be applied, and you're going to keep conditioning sensual desire, for example. But if you're mindful, you apply the insight, the wisdom, uproot ignorance, and that is going to lead to a determination to not feed that said thing when you're mindful, and then it's going to eventually burn out. So it's a process, it's a practice, it's a training, it's insight and practice, and you cannot just do it as single non-duality insight. That is just a conditioned perception that can even be arrived at intellectually. So that is not enlightenment, and there's so many people claiming they're enlightened. I'm not gonna claim I'm enlightened or not, but I'm not. I'm obviously not, otherwise I would be like a monastic arahat or something, right? Not talking about self-view, I'm just using conceptions here. So I'm not going to talk about my own practice, but I'm obviously just someone who's more than a little interested in Buddhism, specifically the Nikayas themselves, so, and what the Buddha taught. So yeah, apply your attention correctly, actually strive diligently, have a sense of urgency to practice, because life is fleeting and access to the Buddha's teachings are conditioned and not always available. Don't waste this chance, and don't settle for a conditioned perception that you mistake for truth. That's about it. Thanks for watching. See you in another video.